The government of Iraq, like in other displacement crises, has also been very eager to promote return as the best and only durable solution, and be able to remove, to lower the figures of the displaced, because it's also a policy tool by saying that stability and security have been restored and the government is able to impose security, but they have failed to look at other durable solutions, in particular integration in the place where displaced people have moved, and also the possibility maybe of settling in a third area. The surveys that have been made show that at least half of the IDP population does not want to go back to the area from where they came from. There are at least two reasons for that. One is that Iraq has experienced a huge demographic change, as I'm sure most of you are aware in this room, where entire areas have been experimenting sectarian or ethnic cleansing, rather sectarian actually cleansing. People who are Shiites don't want to go back to areas where they used to live, who have become entirely Sunni, and vice versa. It's very problematic. The other issue is that people often left areas which are now underserviced by public services, have no job, and you don't also want to return to places where your livelihood is not ensured. So there is definitely a need to look at something else than return in the prospect for durable solutions. I will stop here because I'm running out of time, and we can discuss maybe a few things during the Q&A session.
Good. Well, thank you very much. We have such a rich presentations, and I know there are a lot of questions. If I could just kick off with one, because one of the topics, and I know there's so much to talk about, but one of the topics that we haven't touched on is the minorities. Yeah. For example, the Assyrians and the Chaldeans have various Christian groups, cultural groups within Iraq have fled, many of them to the United States, others to Australia, etc. But in so doing, it really threatens the cultural altogether. So it's no longer simply an issue of protection and survival for the people, but they face a death to a culture that is thousands of years old. Has there been any effort to recollect the people back in Iraq, or is this just not feasible?
If I may answer, I think it is not feasible, I'm not. There has been a lot of efforts. I mean, first of all, the leader of the Eastern churches and the two main churches you mentioned them in Iraq, which are really indigenous churches in Iraq, and they've been there since almost the birth of Christianity in the region. Are calling for the Christians to come back. But to come back to what? Because besides having no protection, it's an issue of protection in the most basic sense. I'm not even talking about protection in its definition in international human rights instruments. Protection today in Iraq is ensured first and foremost within local social networks and neighborhoods and communities. And you have a very good article in your last issue of your in-house journal, which is on tribal justice for
Middle
reconciliation in the Middle East Journal, which I was just reading last night. And this, somehow also shows that one of the problems minorities have in Iraq is that they do not have the backing of tribes. They are not embedded in the tribal structure. The tribal structure in Iraq is currently being used to try to overcome the sectarian violence which has taken place in the last few years, tribes have their own hierarchy, but they do not take into consideration sectarian and religious affiliation. So you can use the tribal system to try to revert the sectarian processes. The problem with minorities, especially Christians, it's less true for a number of other minorities, but the small minorities, they're not embedded in the tribal structure. So they have nobody to protect them in their community through customary traditional protection networks and systems. And at the state level, basically, there is there is lip service to the importance of maintaining the Christians, because the political elite, the government, are aware that it's a very important issue for Western countries, and in particular for the US. But it's not really their primary concern. So that's an issue. So no protection, and also a very bad quality of everyday life. Electricity or electricity cuts, very difficult access to clean water, very bad public services. The inflation is enormous. Baghdad, some areas of Baghdad have some of the highest prices for properties today in the world. It's absolutely amazing, it's you leave and you don't go back in these circumstances. So I'm not very optimistic about the return of Christians.
Yeah. One question for you, Susanne, before we open it up. As you recall, if you were in Kabul in 2000 and 2001, there was a very serious drought in Afghanistan and Pakistan at that time, but there was already a secondary wave of refugees going from Afghanistan into Pakistan even before 9/11 occurred. We've just seen a dramatic climate disaster in Pakistan. I'm not at all sure that it wouldn't be repeated again this next season because many people who follow these weather patterns and how they've been disrupted by climate change believe that the floods could occur again in Pakistan. What about climatic refugee movements? And are they refugees if they're not fleeing from conflict, if they're fleeing for economic reasons? Has the international community resolved that issue yet?
I think they're called disaster-displaced populations, and I think they actually are not counted because they're not in a sense. And often they're easier to assist because there's no political issue around that. You also have flood displacement in Afghanistan more recent, like you had flooding in the north particularly. You've got flash floods in the south. And everybody who said, yes, there was a dramatic drought in Afghanistan, but we have seen more rains. I mean, this particularly winter, while it had less snow, although I heard there's a foot of snow on the ground right now in Kabul, has seen a lot more raining than before. And a lot of the things that assistance is being given is, for example, to build retaining walls that keep the river bed, in its course so it doesn't just destroy crop through flooding. Most of those are considered short-term because, flood comes and goes. The drought were a bit longer. We still actually see some of the IDPs being those drought-affected IDPs from 2000, 2001 that fled then and probably won't be going back to the areas of origin. But, usually they're considered disaster displaced. Often they're assisted side by side. But often it's less political to assist them. It's far much easier to actually find money for disaster displacement. I would argue, even if it's hard enough for a region. So you probably could see it, but that's what I was trying to say, that right now in Pakistan, the long-standing refugees that are linked to a country that is still in turmoil, a lot of the refugee population being kind of scapegoated into, that's where the insurgency comes from, at least where the insurgency recruits from, is competing in terms of assistance, of course, with the more attractive disaster displaced that we all can sympathize with. They've got no political goals. We can all think it happens elsewhere, that you're being displaced by floods.
And even so, they don't get enough to survive.
Yeah, probably. Well, that's because I think the region is underfunded right now. So in those areas of disaster displacement, not in other areas. So